Around 50 CE, in Hierapolis, a boy was born into slavery. His real name has been lost to history. He is known only by the name Epictetus, a Greek word that simply means that which is owned. From the moment of his birth, he had no right to own land, no freedom to decide the course of his life, no status as a citizen. He would never command an army, never write a single work in his own hand. And yet, his ideas outlived emperors and fundamentally transformed the way human beings understand freedom. Here lies the paradox. A man with almost no control over his body or circumstances developed one of the most profound doctrines in history about self-mastery. A slave laid the foundations for what we now call cognitive behavioral therapy. Epictetus lived under the authority of a secretary to Emperor Nero, was permitted to study philosophy, and was freed at around the age of 33. Later, under the reign of Domitian, all philosophers were expelled from Rome. Epictetus moved to Nicopolis in Greece, opened a school that attracted the Roman elite, and taught there until his death around the year 135. He never wrote a single book. Everything we know about him comes from the notes of his student Arrian, who recorded his lectures in two works, Discourses and the Enchiridion. These texts strongly influenced Marcus Aurelius, shaped early Christian thought, disappeared for centuries, and then unexpectedly returned to transform modern psychotherapy. In the 1950s, Albert Ellis built rational emotive behavior therapy directly on Epictetus, based on a core proposition. People are not distressed by events, but by their beliefs about events. The value of Epictetus today does not lie in historical curiosity. It lies in the fact that he precisely identified the mechanism by which human beings create suffering for themselves. He mapped the architecture of inner freedom with almost surgical precision. Without brain scanners or laboratories, he analyzed lived human experience directly and arrived at conclusions that modern science would take 2,000 years to confirm. At the center of Epictetus's entire philosophy is a concept that appears more than 160 times in the surviving texts, prohairesis. No English or Vietnamese translation fully captures its meaning. It is at once will, the capacity for choice, moral purpose, and human essence. Etymologically, pro means before, and hairesis means to choose. Prohairesis is the choice that occurs prior to action, the capacity to evaluate and decide how we respond to the world. Epictetus extended this concept far beyond any philosopher before him. He regarded prohairesis as the faculty that distinguishes humans from animals and as the core of morality. It operates at the intersection of cognition and action, consisting of two tightly linked functions. First, assent, the acceptance or rejection of impressions that appear in the mind. Second, impulse, the tendency to move toward or away from an object. These are not two separate processes, but two aspects of the same act of rational choice. When someone insults you, the sound of words enters the ear, the nervous system processes it, and an impression arises, I have been insulted. This impression is not chosen, it simply happens. But what comes next is where freedom appears. You can pause, examine the impression, and ask, have I truly been harmed? Does my worth depend on another person's words? This moment of evaluation is prohairesis in action. Epictetus clearly distinguishes between the formation of impressions and assent to impressions. The nervous system generates impressions automatically, but prohairesis decides whether you believe them or not. Modern neuroscience describes this mechanism precisely. Rapid emotional reactions originate in the amygdala and subcortical structures, while control, evaluation, and regulation reside in the prefrontal cortex. When you reinterpret a situation, activity in the prefrontal cortex increases while emotional reactivity decreases. This is the biological basis of what Epictetus called inner freedom. From here, Epictetus formulates his famous doctrine: some things are up to us and some things are not. What is up to us are opinions, desires, aversions, impulses. In other words, the entire activity of prohairesis. What is not up to us are the body, possessions, reputation, status, and outcomes. He does not say that we should not care about external things. He says that we should not place our happiness in things we do not fully control. This distinction is far deeper than positive thinking or controlling thoughts. When you raise your hand, the intention to raise it is up to you, but whether the arm actually rises depends on the body, circumstances, and others. Epictetus completely separates choice from outcome. You are absolutely responsible for your choices, but you cannot fully control results. For this reason, he can say that not even Zeus can coerce your proheresis. Others may torture your body, but they cannot force you to believe that what is wrong is right. Belief always requires inner assent. This has major implications for psychology. Depression, anxiety, and anger are not merely spontaneous emotions, but the consequences of judgments, often unconscious, that have been accepted about the value and meaning of events. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy is essentially the retraining of proheresis. It teaches people to identify automatic thoughts, create distance from them, test their rationality, and replace them with evaluations more consistent with reality. Epictetus called this the proper use of impressions. When a thought arises, say to it, "You are only an impression, not necessarily the truth." He did not call for the suppression of emotions, but for their transformation by changing the judgments that produce them. The wise person is not emotionless, but has emotions aligned with reason. They take joy in virtue, exercise caution toward error, but do not despair over what lies beyond their control. Finally, Epictetus affirms that a human being is precisely the way they choose. Character is not a mysterious essence, but a stable pattern of judgments and responses. You become courageous by repeatedly choosing courage. You become free by practicing the refusal to assent to false impressions about good and evil. 2,000 years later, science confirms that the brain truly has mechanisms that allow us to create distance between stimulus and response. But Epictetus saw this through the lived experience of a slave. He showed that freedom does not begin with changing the world, but with understanding where the world cannot reach, your own capacity to choose. However, Epictetus's philosophy does not stop at analyzing inner freedom as an abstract capacity. He was concerned with a far more practical question. How can this power of choice not merely exist in theory, but become a stable habit of living amid the pressure, suffering, and chaos of human life? His answer lies in a core practice: training the way we use impressions. Epictetus believed that the human mind is like a city with gates constantly open. At every moment, countless impressions flood in: images, sounds, memories, speculations, anxieties, hopes. The problem is not how to block them, that is impossible. The problem is who is allowed to enter and who is turned away. Every impression carries an implicit claim. It does not merely say, "This is what happened," but also whispers, "This is good, this is bad, this is dangerous, this is what you need." Most people live as if these whispers were self-evident truths. They react immediately, without realizing that they have just assented to an unexamined judgment. Epictetus asks his students to do something that sounds simple, but is extraordinarily difficult. Stop. When an impression appears, temporarily refuse to believe it. Look at it as something external, not as your own voice. He advises students to speak directly to the impression. You are only an impression, not the reality you claim to be. This moment creates a tiny gap between stimulus and response. Yet it is precisely within this gap that freedom resides. In that space, proheresis has the opportunity to act. You can ask, is this impression telling the truth? Is it consistent with reason? Is it consistent with what I know about what is truly good and truly bad? If an impression declares that damage to reputation is a terrible thing, you compare it with Stoic principles. Reputation lies outside your control. Therefore, it cannot be an absolute good or evil. If an impression claims that losing money is a catastrophe, you re-examine it. Is money necessary for character, for integrity, for your capacity to choose rightly? If not, then the impression has exaggerated the truth. What matters here is that Epictetus does not deny reality. He does not say that losing money or being insulted is nothing. He draws a sharp distinction between the event and its value. An event may be unfavorable, painful, uncomfortable. But calling it a disaster or the ruin of my life is an added judgment, and that judgment belongs to you, not to the event. Over time, this way of using impressions ceases to be a forced effort and becomes a natural disposition. Proheresis is trained like a muscle. Each time you refuse assent to a false judgment, you strengthen your capacity for freedom. Each time you react blindly, you weaken it. Epictetus emphasizes that no one becomes free merely by understanding philosophy. Knowledge without practice is only a refined illusion. He compares those who enjoy debating philosophy but do not live by it to patients who read medical books yet never take their medicine. Philosophy for him is a form of therapy, and therapy always requires consistent practice. For this reason, he proposes concrete exercises. Each morning, prepare yourself for what is unwelcome: rudeness, misunderstanding, selfishness, betrayal. Not to become pessimistic, but to avoid being surprised. When these things occur, you no longer react as if they were intolerable anomalies, but recognize them as part of the nature of untrained human beings. Each evening, examine yourself, not to condemn yourself, but to learn. Today, which impressions did I assent to too hastily? What external things did I allow to govern my inner state? Where did I maintain calm, and where did I lose it? This self-examination is not meant to judge your worth, but to improve your capacity for choice in the future. Gradually, something strange happens. When you no longer regard external events as the source of happiness or misery, you become less manipulable. Praise does not intoxicate you. Criticism does not crush you. Success does not make you arrogant. Failure does not drive you to despair. Not because you lack emotion, but because your emotions have been placed in their proper position. At a deeper level, Epictetus arrives at a bold conclusion. Human beings are not harmed by anything that happens to them, but only by the way they use their power of choice. The only thing that is truly bad is the misuse of prohoresis, believing what is not worthy of belief, desiring what should not be desired, fearing what need not be feared. From this perspective, freedom is not the ability to do whatever one wants, but the ability not to be compelled to want the wrong things. An addict, a greedy person, someone who lives constantly in fear, does so not because the world is too cruel, but because their prohoresis has been trained to respond incorrectly to the world. Epictetus does not promise an easy life. He promises a resilient one. He does not say that you will avoid loss, suffering, or injustice. He says that you can avoid destroying yourself from within. In a world where most events lie beyond our control, that is no small promise. If political freedom can be taken away, inner freedom disappears only when we give it away ourselves. And Epictetus, once a slave, understood this more clearly than anyone. But Epictetus did not stop at helping people avoid suffering. If that were all, his philosophy would resemble a form of psychological self-defense, a kind of emotional numbing designed to prevent harm. He went further. His goal was not to evade pain, but to live in accordance with human nature. According to Epictetus, human beings are not born to pursue pleasure, nor to accumulate power or wealth. They are born to use reason correctly. Reason is not a tool for obtaining everything one desires. It is the standard by which we determine what is worth desiring and what is not. When reason functions properly, it does not eliminate emotion, but places emotion in order. For this reason, Epictetus distinguishes between destructive emotions and healthy ones. He does not deny emotion, but he argues that most human emotions are products of false judgments. Excessive fear arises from believing that external things have the power to destroy us. Anger arises from believing that others are obliged to behave according to our wishes. Despair arises from believing that happiness depends on something that can be lost. By contrast, Epictetus speaks of good emotions, emotions that are in harmony with reason. Joy in acting rightly, tranquility in fulfilling one's duty, calmness in the face of adversity. These are not weak emotions, but the emotions of a mind no longer torn apart by conflicting demands. From here, Epictetus advances a view that many modern people find uncomfortable. Happiness is not a prolonged state of pleasant feeling, but the condition of a faculty functioning correctly. A good knife is not good because it is shiny, but because it cuts well. A good human being is not good because they always feel happy, but because they consistently choose rightly within their capacity. This perspective completely changes how we view failure and suffering. If you have acted with reason, goodwill, and integrity, then no matter how bad the outcome, you have not failed in the deepest sense. True failure occurs only when you betray your own capacity to choose correctly. Epictetus calls this ideal state living in accordance with nature. But nature here does not mean instinct or crude desire. Human nature is reason. To live contrary to nature is to let desire, fear, and public opinion lead you. To live in accordance with nature is to let prohoresis guide desires, fears, and actions. At this point, Epictetus's philosophy becomes especially relevant to modern life. We live in a world that continuously assaults proheresis. Social media generates constant impressions of comparison. Advertising creates the impression that you are lacking and must buy more to be complete. News creates the impression that the world is always in crisis and that you must remain perpetually anxious. Every day, thousands of impressions are deliberately designed to bypass your capacity for control. If you respond to all of them as if they were self-evident truths, you will live in a state of chronic tension. Epictetus could not have known about social media or algorithms, but he understood the nature of the human mind very well. It is easily carried away if it is not trained. In this context, training proheresis is no longer a philosophical pastime, but a skill of psychological survival. Not to become indifferent, but to avoid being swept away. Not to withdraw from society, but to participate in it with a mind that is not torn to pieces. Epictetus also did not call for withdrawal from social responsibility. On the contrary, he emphasized that each person occupies certain roles, as a child, a parent, a citizen, a friend. What Stoicism demands is not the abandonment of these roles, but the performance of them without equating one's worth with the final outcome. You can be a devoted father and still lose your child. You can be an upright citizen and still live in an unjust society. You can work hard and still fail. Epictetus does not deny this tragedy. He simply says that tragedy does not lie in bad things happening, but in allowing those bad things to destroy your capacity to choose rightly. At its deepest level, Epictetus's philosophy is an invitation to maturity. It asks you to abandon the illusion that the world is obliged to make you happy. It asks you to accept that much of what matters to you lies beyond your control. But in return, it gives you something no one can take away: responsibility and power over your own inner life. Freedom, according to Epictetus, is not the ability to do whatever one wants, but the ability not to be compelled to want the wrong things. When you no longer confuse value with circumstance, character with outcome, person with role, you become difficult to harm in the deepest sense. Perhaps that is why the thought of a former slave resonates so strongly in times of instability. When the external world becomes unpredictable, when familiar structures collapse, when people feel they've lost control, Epictetus reminds us that there remains one place where order can still be established: how we think, how we judge, how we choose. And if there is one most enduring legacy that Epictetus left behind, it is not a rigid philosophical system, but a question that echoes in every circumstance. Is this within my power of choice or not? If it is, take full responsibility. If it is not, let it go without bitterness. Between these two attitudes, a resilient life can be formed, even in a world that is never stable. He did not say that human beings cannot be physically harmed, cannot suffer loss, cannot endure injustice. He said that the deepest suffering, the collapse of the inner life, always begins from within. When you believe that your honor depends on other people's words, you have handed control over to them. When you believe that your worth depends on external success, you have tied your happiness to something unstable. And when you believe that life should have been different, you enter a battle with reality that cannot be won. Epictetus was especially wary of the concept of should. In his view, should is the source of much mental suffering. The world does not operate according to personal desires, and resisting reality with resentment only increases pain without changing anything. Acceptance here does not mean surrender, but seeing things as they truly are so that you can choose the most appropriate response in the part that still belongs to you. This requires a very high degree of honesty with oneself. Epictetus urges people to question themselves regularly. Am I suffering because of what actually happened, or because of how I am interpreting it? Am I angry because I was insulted, or because I believe I should not have been insulted? Am I afraid because there is real danger, or because I am imagining the worst possible outcome? This self-questioning is not meant for self-blame, but for dismantling false assumptions that have taken root in the mind. Once the assumptions change, the emotions change as well, not through force, but through understanding. Epictetus regarded the training of the mind as a long-term process, like training the body. No one becomes resilient after a single lesson or a single reading. Every day is a small exercise. When insulted, pause before reacting. When facing loss, distinguish between natural grief and despair born of false judgment. When succeeding, be wary of the illusion that you now control the future. He even advised people to prepare themselves mentally for things that might go wrong, not in order to live in anxiety, but so that when they occur, we are not caught off guard. Loss becomes destructive only when we believe it should not have happened. When we understand the fragile nature of all external things, the pain remains, but it no longer destroys the entire inner structure. Here, Epictetus touches on a truth that is rarely spoken. Mental strength is not the absence of pain, but the ability to carry pain without losing oneself. A mature person is not someone who never falls, but someone who does not allow each fall to define their entire being. Epictetus' philosophy, therefore, is not for those seeking quick comfort. It is for those who accept the rigor of conscious living. It does not promise that you will always be happy, but it promises that you will no longer be a victim of chaotic emotional waves. It does not make life simpler, but it makes you steadier within a complex life. And perhaps the greatest value of Epictetus lies in the fact that he restores to human beings a sense of inner dignity. No matter your circumstances, no matter how much power you have or how little you hold in your hands, you still possess the capacity to choose how you live. No one can take that capacity from you unless you give it away yourself. In a world that constantly encourages people to chase recognition, Epictetus calls us back to a more fundamental question. Are we living in accordance with what we ourselves believe to be right? When that question becomes central, the surrounding noise gradually loses its power to dominate. And then, wherever life may take you, you walk with something that very few people manage to preserve, an inner life that has not been exiled from itself. He believed that most people live in a quiet confusion. They spend their entire lives trying to control what cannot be controlled, other people's opinions, the course of the future, absolute fairness, while neglecting the only thing they truly command, the way they think and act. This confusion creates a bitter paradox. The more people try to grasp, the more they lose their sense of freedom. Epictetus did not deny the desire to improve the world, but he insisted that any effort at improvement has value only when it arises from an inner life that is not dependent on outcomes. If you do what is right only when it brings success, you have handed your morality over to chance. If you speak the truth only when it is welcomed, you are no longer honest. You are merely calculating. For this reason, he advised people to measure their lives not by achievements, but by consistency. Do you act in accordance with what you believe is right, even when it is disadvantageous? Do you maintain integrity when no one is watching? Are you calm in the face of praise and blame, or does your inner state fluctuate with every small external reaction? These questions are uncomfortable because they do not allow us to shift blame. They force us to confront personal responsibility. Epictetus believed that people often fear freedom more than oppression because freedom means there is no one else left to blame for one's life. At a deeper level, his philosophy touches the problem of identity. Epictetus argued that people suffer because they identify themselves with unstable things: titles, possessions, social images, even family roles. When these things change, and they always do, people feel as though they themselves are shaken. But if you anchor your identity in inner qualities, in the way you choose in each circumstance, you possess a foundation that is not easily taken away. This does not mean living detached or coldly. On the contrary, Epictetus believed that only when you stop clinging can you truly connect in a healthy way. You love without possessing. You care without controlling. You contribute without demanding that the world repay you fairly. There is a particular lightness in this way of living. Not the lightness of escaping responsibility, but the lightness of placing responsibility where it belongs. You no longer carry the burden of making everything turn out the way you want. You carry only the responsibility of living rightly within what is yours to do. Epictetus understood that this is not a path for the majority. It requires inner discipline, patience, and a certain degree of solitude. For when you no longer chase common measures of success, you will not always be understood. But in return, you gain something rare: agreement with yourself. And perhaps that is the deepest freedom Epictetus meant. Not freedom from circumstances, but freedom from inner division. When what you think, what you say, and what you do are no longer in conflict, you enter a state that very few events can completely shatter. In the end, Epictetus did not promise that this path would make life easy. He only said that it would make life more right. And sometimes, that very rightness is the only thing that allows a human being to stand firm when everything else is in flux. According to Epictetus, there is no neutral moment in inner life. Every reaction, every thought, every time you choose silence or anger, concession or firmness, is quietly training your mind. If you complain frequently, you are training the habit of dissatisfaction. If you habitually blame others, you are training helplessness. If you constantly chase recognition, you are training dependence. And these habits over time become character and then become your spiritual destiny. Epictetus viewed the mind as a fortress. This fortress does not collapse because of a single massive assault, but because small gates are left constantly open. Each time you allow a false impression to pass through without examination, you widen another entrance for chaos. For this reason, he demanded continuous awareness, not tense vigilance, but steady attentiveness, like a gatekeeper who does not fall asleep, yet does not panic at every sound. This is especially difficult in everyday life, where people are swept along by speed and instant reaction. Epictetus clearly understood that most mistakes do not arise from malice, but from a failure to pause. We react before we reflect. We believe before we verify. We suffer before we distinguish what belongs to us from what does not. That is why one of the most important practices he proposed was the inner pause, a brief moment to ask, is this truly something bad or merely an impression of something bad? That single question, if asked often enough, can change the entire mental structure of a person. It does not remove difficulty, but it removes panic. It does not erase loss, but it prevents loss from becoming a psychological catastrophe. And more importantly, it restores to human beings agency in how they live, instead of leaving them to react like creatures constantly driven by stimuli. Epictetus was also very candid about the cost of this way of life. He did not romanticize the Stoic path. He stated plainly that those who choose to live by reason will often feel out of place. They do not easily merge with collective excitement, nor do they readily share in collective outrage. When everyone complains together, they remain silent. When everyone assigns blame, they turn inward to examine themselves. This is easily mistaken for coldness, arrogance, or indifference, but in truth it is the price of self-mastery. Yet Epictetus believed this price was far smaller than the cost of a life torn apart by uncontrolled emotions. A person may fit perfectly into society and yet be alienated from themselves. They may be liked, recognized, praised, yet inwardly remain anxious, fearful of loss, constantly performing roles to meet others' expectations. For Epictetus, that is true exile. At a deeper level, his philosophy touches on the relationship between human beings and fate. Epictetus did not deny fate, but he rejected the way people commonly understand it. Fate for him is not a series of events imposed upon us, but the context in which we are given the opportunity to display our character. An illness is not only a misfortune, but also a test of patience. An injustice is not only a loss, but also a test of integrity. A loss is not only painful, but also a test of the capacity to let go. From this perspective, life is no longer something that merely happens to us, but something we actively participate in shaping through our responses. Two people may live in the same circumstances, endure the same events, yet have entirely different inner experiences. One becomes bitter, withdrawn, and resentful. The other becomes calmer, deeper, and more resilient. The difference lies not in the circumstances, but in how they use their inner power of choice. Epictetus emphasized strongly that no one can live this part of life for you. No teacher, no book, no philosophy can carry the burden of inner training on your behalf. Philosophy can only point the way. It cannot walk it for you. And if you enjoy philosophy merely as a beautiful idea, without allowing it to shape how you respond to everyday life, then it is nothing more than a form of intellectual decoration. Therefore, he advised people to begin with very small things. There is no need to wait for major crises. Observe how you react when you are interrupted, how you react when you are misunderstood, how you react when a small plan is disrupted. It is precisely in these seemingly insignificant moments that your inner structure is revealed most clearly. Whoever can master small reactions is the one who has hope of standing firm before the great blows of life. Gradually, if this training is sustained, a subtle transformation occurs. You no longer react as quickly as before, but you see more clearly. You are no longer easily swept into other people's emotions, yet you understand them more deeply. You no longer feel the need to prove yourself excessively because your value no longer depends on external validation. A new kind of calm emerges, quiet, unshowy, but difficult to shake. Epictetus called this state inner harmony, not because all problems have been solved, but because there is no longer an inner civil war. When desire, fear, and reason no longer pull you in opposing directions, mental energy is no longer wasted. A person in this state can endure more, not because they are hardened, but because they no longer weaken themselves from within. And at this point, Epictetus's philosophy reaches a profound paradox. When you no longer live to protect a fragile ego, you become far stronger. Not because you win more often, but because you can lose without collapsing. Not because you control the world, but because the world no longer controls you. Perhaps that is why the thought of a man who was once a slave has survived thousands of years of upheaval. For when all external systems can collapse, politics, economics, reputation, power, the capacity for inner self-mastery remains the last fortress of human beings. And Epictetus, in his severity and simplicity, showed that this fortress does not need to be built of steel or stone, but of awareness, discipline, and honesty with oneself. One of the greatest illusions that Epictetus repeatedly warned against is the belief that we truly understand ourselves. People often assume they know who they are, what they value, and how they would act when faced with trials. But according to Epictetus, most of what we think we know about ourselves exists only before it has been tested. Only when loss occurs, when we are insulted, when we find ourselves in unfavorable circumstances, does our true nature reveal itself. And very often it does not resemble the image we once trusted. For this reason, Epictetus believed that life constantly exposes us. Every event becomes a mirror, reflecting not the world, but the structure of our inner life. When you become angry, it is not merely because of the situation, but because within you already exists a belief that you deserve to be treated in a certain way. When you fall into despair, it is not simply because of loss, but because you placed your happiness in something that could be taken away. No event in itself has enough power to destroy a person. Only unexamined beliefs can do that. Here, Epictetus makes a severe demand. Take responsibility not only for your actions, but also for the silent judgments that stand behind those actions. This is the point where many people hesitate because it does not allow us to hide behind circumstances, childhood, society, or fate. Not because these factors have no influence, but because once we grant them authority over our inner life, we will never escape the role of the victim. Epictetus did not say this to make people feel guilty, but to restore their dignity. A dignified person is someone who knows that even if they cannot control everything, they still retain the power to choose their attitude toward everything. And it is precisely this power of choice that gives a human life its value, not the sequence of events that happen to it. From this perspective, Epictetus re-examines everything people usually pursue and places it under a different light. Fame, in his view, is not dangerous because it is evil, but because it easily leads people away from themselves. When you begin to say what you do not believe in order to be liked, or do what you do not respect in order to be recognized, you lose not only consistency, but also the ability to trust yourself. And once a person no longer trusts their own judgment, they become more easily controlled than by any external pressure. Epictetus was particularly harsh toward moral pretense. He believed that nothing is more dangerous than a person who thinks they are living rightly, when in fact, they are merely performing the role of righteousness. Morality, for him, does not reside in appearances, but in choices made when no one is watching. It is not found in declarations, but in spontaneous reactions to adversity. A person may speak eloquently about virtue, yet a minor inconvenience is enough to reveal irritability, selfishness, or fear. For Epictetus, this is not failure, but data. Data that shows where one truly stands on the path of inner training. At an even deeper level, Epictetus addresses the relationship between human beings and time. He observed that most suffering does not lie in the present, but in fixation on the past and anxiety about the future. People regret what cannot be changed or fear what has not yet happened, while the present, the only place where action is possible, is neglected. Epictetus did not deny memory or planning, but he emphasized that only the present lies within our immediate power of choice. Every meaningful effort to live well must begin in this moment, with these circumstances, with the person we currently are. This leads to a crucial shift in how life is understood. Instead of asking, "Who will I become in the future?" Epictetus urges us to ask, "Who am I choosing to become right now?" Because the future ultimately is nothing more than an extension of present choices. There is no sudden moral leap. There is no miraculous transformation without training. Every great quality is formed from small decisions, repeated over time, often in ordinary situations that attract no attention. Epictetus also spoke clearly about the spiritual solitude this path can bring. When you no longer chase common standards, you will not always be understood. If you refuse to blame, you will not blend into collective complaints. When you choose silence instead of impulsive reaction, you may be mistaken for weak or indifferent. But Epictetus considered this an inevitable part of maturity. Not everyone is willing to face their inner life, and you cannot live honestly without accepting a certain degree of difference. However, he also emphasized that Stoicism is not a withdrawal from life. On the contrary, it demands fuller presence. When you are no longer driven by unconscious emotions, you listen better. When you are no longer excessively defensive, you understand others more deeply. When you are no longer obsessed with protecting your ego, you can act for what is right rather than for your own image. At this point, Epictetus presents a very different conception of courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear determine action. Courage is not loud confrontation, but quiet fidelity to principle. And sometimes the greatest courage lies in accepting loss without allowing it to harden into bitterness. Gradually, if one travels far enough along this path, a fundamental change occurs in how the world is seen. The world is no longer divided simply into favorable and unfavorable events, but into different circumstances in which virtue can be practiced. A good day is no longer a day when everything goes smoothly, but a day when you do not betray what you believe is right. A bad day is not one filled with difficulty, but one in which difficulty pulls you away from reason and dignity. Epictetus did not promise that this way of living would bring comfort. He acknowledged that it requires continuous effort, vigilance toward oneself, and a level of humility that not everyone is willing to accept. But he also affirmed that there is no other path to lasting inner freedom. Every easier route must be paid for with dependence on others, on circumstances, or on uncontrolled emotions. And at its deepest level, the philosophy of Epictetus is no longer about control, but about reconciliation. Reconciliation between human beings and reality. Reconciliation between desire and limitation. Reconciliation between what cannot be changed and what can still be chosen. When this reconciliation occurs, life is no longer seen as a series of injustices to be fought, but as a current to be moved with in awareness. Perhaps that is why Epictetus never spoke of happiness in the conventional sense. He spoke of serenity, of steadiness, of a state in which a person is no longer torn between what they want and what they know to be right. It is not a peak emotion, but a deep foundation, quietly supporting the whole of life. And when a person reaches that point, there is nothing left to prove. No need to win in order to feel worthy. No need for praise to believe one is on the right path. They walk through life with a quiet certainty. Whatever happens, they can live without losing themselves. And when one reaches the furthest point of this path, Epictetus no longer asks human beings to do anything more. He does not introduce a new technique, nor does he offer a more complex principle. Instead, he invites people to let go, not to give up, but to release the final illusions of controlling the world, other people, and fate. Here, Stoic philosophy reaches its quietest state, yet also its most powerful. For when human beings no longer resist reality with resentment, no longer bargain with life through conditions, no longer place their happiness in fragile things, they enter a state that Epictetus regarded as true freedom. A freedom that is not loud, not performative, not in need of recognition, yet impossible to take away. Epictetus understood clearly a truth that many later generations have tried to avoid. Life has no obligation to be fair in the way humans desire. It does not distribute rewards according to virtue, nor does it immediately punish wrongdoing. Good people may still suffer loss. Upright people may still fail. Those who live rightly may still be lonely. And if a person sets the condition, I will live well if life treats me well, they surrender mastery over their life from the very beginning. For this reason, Epictetus completely reverses conventional logic. He does not ask what life has given you, but who you have become in response to what life has given. He does not measure a life by a sequence of events, but by how well a person preserves their character when tested. And from this
Around 50
perspective,
CE,
no life is meaningless, because there is no circumstance in which a person entirely loses the freedom to choose their attitude. At the deepest level, Epictetus does not teach people to avoid suffering, but to prevent suffering from turning into hatred, bitterness, or self-betrayal. He acknowledges that sorrow is natural, loss is inevitable, and weakness is part of the human condition. But he refuses to turn these realities into excuses for living in prolonged resentment, blame, and despair. For him, suffering is an experience, not an identity. It is precisely here that Stoic philosophy touches a profoundly human form of humanism. It does not demand that people become superhuman. It asks only that they not betray the best part of themselves when faced with the worst circumstances. Not everyone can change the world, but everyone can choose not to become cruel, dishonest, or to lose their integrity simply because the world is unjust. Epictetus also understood that this path does not bring glory. It does not make you stand out in the eyes of the crowd. On the contrary, it may make you quieter, slower, less reactive. But within that quietness, another kind of strength is formed, the strength of an inner life no longer governed by fear and unconscious desire. When people reach this state, they no longer need to defeat others in order to feel valuable. They no longer need to be right in every argument. They no longer need to be liked by everyone. They move through life with a quiet steadiness, like someone who knows exactly where they stand and is no longer dragged about by external waves. Epictetus called this harmony with nature, but in truth, it is harmony with oneself. When reason, action, and values are no longer in conflict, a person no longer lives in a state of constant inner tension. Mental energy is no longer wasted on defending the ego, comparing, competing, or proving oneself. Instead, it is used to live fully in each moment, whether that moment is favorable or adverse. And what is most striking is this: when people no longer cling to outcomes, they often act better. When they no longer fear failure, they dare to be more honest. When they no longer fear being hurt, they dare to love without possessing. When they are no longer obsessed with self-image, they become more sincere and more trustworthy. Inner freedom, paradoxically, becomes the foundation of the healthiest relationships. Epictetus did not promise that you would always be at peace. He promised only that you would no longer be torn apart by futile inner wars. He did not promise that you would not feel pain. He promised only that pain would not turn you into someone you yourself do not respect. And in a world full of uncertainty, that may be the most realistic and precious promise philosophy can offer. When we look back at the entirety of Epictetus' thought, we see that he did not build a system to help people escape life, but to help them remain within it, yet with a more mature inner life, greater awareness, and fewer illusions. He did not call on people to abandon the world, but to abandon the confusion that the world must serve their ego. And perhaps this is the most complete to the philosophy of a man who was once a slave, but was never subdued. While everything external can be taken away, physical freedom, property, status, even life itself, the way we choose to live in the face of these things always remains ours, until the final breath. Epictetus did not leave posterity a comforting piece of advice. He left a stern, yet liberating reminder. Life does not promise to be gentle, but you can always choose not to be distorted by it. You cannot control the world, but you can control whether you live rightly or not. And when you preserve that, then wherever you stand within the social order, you remain a free human being. That is the conclusion of Stoic philosophy, not through victory, not through loud happiness, but through a quiet steadiness in which a person no longer needs to run from themselves. And if we were to stop here, we still would not have reached the most important thing Epictetus wished to leave behind. For he did not merely want people to understand what freedom is. He wanted them to practice living as free human beings in everyday life amid things that are very small, very ordinary, very human. Freedom, according to Epictetus, does not reside in grand moments. It does not appear when you win, when you are recognized, when you obtain what you desire. Freedom appears in moments no one sees. When you are misunderstood but do not rush to defend yourself with resentment. When you fail but do not turn to despising yourself. When you are rejected but do not transform pain into bitterness. These are the places where true freedom is tested, and also where it is born. Epictetus understood that human beings are rarely destroyed by great tragedies, but by daily mental erosion, small disappointments repeated over and over, expectations left unmet, silent comparisons, thoughts no one else hears but which we hear every day. And it is precisely here that prohairesis, the capacity to choose one's judgments and attitudes, becomes the final line of defense of human dignity. When a person is no longer aware that they are choosing, they begin to live as a reflex. They become angry because they are provoked. They feel sad because of circumstances. They envy because others have more. They fear because the future has not yet arrived. And in that state, even if they are not imprisoned, they live as slaves. Slaves to emotion, to circumstance, to other people's opinions, to standards they have never examined for themselves. Epictetus regarded this as the greatest tragedy of human life, living without knowing to whom one is handing over control. Each time you say, "I cannot bear this," you give power to external things. Each time you say, "I cannot be happy without that," you chain yourself to something uncertain. And with each such moment, inner freedom shrinks a little more, until many people live their entire lives without ever truly touching it. Yet Epictetus was not despairing about humanity. On the contrary, he believed that every moment is an opportunity to reclaim the power of choice, no matter how long one has lived in error. No special event is required, no dramatic turning point, only a moment of awareness in which you realize, this is an impression, and I am not yet obliged to believe it. That very moment, however brief, is already freedom, and if that moment is repeated often enough, it becomes a habit. When the habit grows firm, it becomes character. When character becomes stable, it becomes a way of life. Epictetus did not promise instant liberation. He promised a path that can be walked step by step without miracles, without special gifts, requiring only honesty with oneself. The most frightening thing, according to Epictetus, is not suffering, but suffering without understanding why one suffers. Not failure, but failing, and then concluding that one is worthless. Not loss, but believing that loss has stolen one's ability to live rightly. When people misunderstand the source of their suffering, they seek the wrong solutions, and the more they seek, the further they stray. The philosophy of Epictetus, therefore, is not a system to believe in, but a system to practice. It requires you to observe yourself more than you observe the world, to be more rigorous with your own judgments than with other people's mistakes, to accept that much of our suffering does not come from what happens, but from the story we tell ourselves about what happens. And this is precisely what makes Epictetus especially relevant to the modern age, an age in which human beings are surrounded by information, comparison, expectations, standards of success, and the pressure to become someone. Never before have people had so much convenience, and yet never have they been so anxious. Not because life is worse, but because the mind has never been pulled so far away from the present moment and from itself. Epictetus does not tell you to abandon this world. He only asks that you not allow the world to define your value. He does not ask you to give up goals, but to clearly distinguish between goals and yourself. You may pursue success, but do not identify yourself with success. You may wish to be loved, but do not make it a condition for respecting yourself. When people manage to do this, a profound transformation occurs. They begin to live more slowly, but more securely. They react less, but act more deliberately. They are less swept away by fleeting emotions, yet live more fully in whatever they do. They do not become cold, they become composed. They do not become indifferent, they become steady. Epictetus never promised that this way of life would be comfortable, but he gave human beings something more valuable than comfort, dignity. The dignity of a person who no longer has to beg circumstances to treat them well in order to live rightly. The dignity of someone who understands that no matter how harsh life may be, they can still keep their mind from being corrupted. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of Epictetus, not beautiful quotations, not historical influence, but a quiet reminder that you may be hurt, but you are not required to become bitter. You may fail, but you are not required to despise yourself. You may lose many things, but you are not required to lose yourself. When this is understood, people no longer live to avoid suffering, but to remain worthy of themselves, regardless of circumstance. And within that worthiness, a deep kind of peace emerges, not because life is perfect, but because the inner self no longer betrays itself.